The wind here doesn't just howl, it gnaws. It slips through every crack, cuts through to your bones. The rain comes often, and when the clouds closed in, it felt like the sky was sinking, along with their hope. There were days when the sun forgot to rise, nights when the darkness felt endless. This place wasn't built for comfort, it was built for forgetting. Those sent here were meant to vanish, swallowed by the storm, by silence, and by time. But even in the harshest corners of the world, something flickers. A stubborn pulse, a refusal, a plan. It was defiance, not just of chains or walls, but of everything this place was meant to destroy. Welcome to If These Trees Could Talk.
Today we are sharing our stories from Wanneroo land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters from here and of Tasmania's west coast, where today's story takes place, in particular the Tugi people of the Macquarie Harbour region, whose deep connection to this place stretches back tens of thousands of years. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal communities who continue to care for country, culture and spirit. This land, rugged, wild and beautiful, has long been a place of deep meaning and survival. Long before prisons were built, before ships arrived, this was and always will be Aboriginal land.
So these men were in jail in Hobart for nearly 2 years, believing that they were going to get hanged. I think he had 800 floggings over the period of the time he was a convict. It's the story that gets underneath his skin, and it's the place. Just be careful who you hang out with when you go up to heaven, that's all I can say.
If you ever find yourself on Tasmania's west coast, chances are you will end up in Strahan. This tiny isolated town that sits right on the edge of Macquarie Harbour is a beautiful spot, popular with tourists for its wilderness cruises, its dramatic landscapes, but its past is anything but peaceful. Just a short boat ride from Strahan is Sarah Island, one of the most notorious penal settlements in Australia's convict history. Back in the early 1800s, this was a place where the worst of the worst was sent, or at least that's how the authorities saw it. The island was remote, cold, wet, and surrounded by thick rainforest and treacherous waters. It was chosen precisely because it was so hard to escape from. But there was also a financial drawcard that influenced the decision-making around its location, and it had everything to do with the trees. Many say life on Sarah Island was hell on earth, prompting some of the most incredible and notable convict escapes in Australian history. Today we welcome Kiah Davey, the Managing Director of the Round Earth Company, who is herself a part of the modern legacy of Sarah Island, to share with us some of the history and one of the most extraordinary tales I have ever come across on my travels, the escape of the Frederick, that was brought to life for us after an incredible day of adventure back on the shore of Macquarie Harbour. Hi, Kiah.
Gosh, hi. That's a big intro.
I'm so excited to be able to talk about this experience with you because for me, it was one of the highlights of my very first trip to Tassie. I knew very little of the history of Sarah Island before I went. I knew quite a lot about Port Arthur, and I don't think I even knew that there was a penal settlement prior to Port Arthur. I just assumed that that was the original. I know that this is a place that you have spent a lot of time, and it is brilliant to be able to experience it with the staff from the Round Earth Company because they are a group of incredibly passionate people. So would you like to give us a little bit of the history and what life was like for the convicts on Sarah Island?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to say that you're not the only one who doesn't realise that Sarah Island was a convict settlement before Port Arthur. It's one of the things that we actually quite like about having visitors coming to Sarah Island is that they don't know what to expect and they've never heard of this place before. So it gives us an opportunity to really educate people without them coming in with biases, which is fantastic. Sarah Island, really quite an extraordinary history. Started in 1822 and only ran for 12 years, which is very unusual for a convict settlement, particularly one that had the infrastructure that was put in place in the 12-year period. Governor Sorrell decided to start Sarah Island in order to harvest Huon pine from the area. Huon pine is only found in the southwest corner of Tasmania, and it is really fantastic boat building timber. And of course, in those days, transport by boat was paramount. It was the most important form of transport. And significant stands of Huon pine were found around Macquarie Harbour, and they decided that the best way to harvest it was to use convict slave labour. And they started the settlement in 1822 and ran it until 1833. They initially wanted just to harvest Huon pine. They weren't interested in boat building, but the bad weather that they have on the west coast made it very difficult for supply ships to arrive to and from Hobart. So the fastest recorded trip from Sarah Island to Hobart was 36 hours. Which is going with the weather. Yeah. But against the weather, the fastest recorded trip was 9 days and the longest was 11 weeks.
Wow.
So, yeah. So that meant that they couldn't ship out the timber fast enough. They had so much, they were harvesting so much Huon pine. They harvested something like 6,000 to 8,000 trees a year, which is quite phenomenal, considering the conditions that the men had to work in and the areas and the fact that they had to row from Sarah Island to where the stands of Huon pine were, harvest them and then, spend a week there and then row back and then bring all the timbers back to Sarah Island. So they decided to start building ships there. And within 2 years of establishing Sarah Island, they actually had ships being built on Sarah Island. And in the end, they built 131 vessels over a 12-year period, which is quite phenomenal. And 96 of those were built in the last 5 or 6 years.
So not everybody on Sarah Island was obviously a convict. Like, this is where David Hoy and that come into this story because of this significant shipbuilding. It was drawing master shipbuilders from all over the world.
Not shipbuilders in plural.
Okay, just one.
Okay, there were 2 shipbuilders. One was a fella by the name of Thomas Cole, who apparently wasn't very good at what he was doing. He was employed by the government to come and build the ships early on, and he was actually had a reputation of being pretty bad. And most of the ships that he built on Sarah Island that then became supply ships running between Hobart and Sarah Island were then rejigged by David Hoy when he arrived in the settlement later on because they weren't good enough. Fortunately, he had a convict by the name of Newton Gray working with him. This is Thomas Cole, the original shipwright, who knew what he was doing. He actually had a bit of a brain, and he obviously used to fix a lot of the problems for the ships and make sure that they were seaworthy before being launched, which is the only reason why Thomas Cole actually has ships listed as under his name, because he had quite good convicts who were knowing what they should do in order to be able to make the ships work. So Thomas Cole was there for about 3 or 4 years and only built a handful of ships. I think it was 30 maybe.
Okay.
Then David Hoy, the master shipwright who had been working in Boston years before, joined. He was employed by the government to come and build ships on Sarah Island, and he chose to come because he wanted to be at the source of Huon pine, and he wanted to be able to choose the best quality timber for his ships. And he built, as I said, 96 ships and boats in 6 years, which is
that's incredible.
It was the largest producing shipyard in Australia at the time.
I've heard it referenced as Australia's first TAFE college or trade college.
Yes. And that's because they were teaching the convicts the skills that were needed in order to be able to build these ships while they were working. So they didn't specifically choose convicts who had the skills needed sent to Sarah Island. The men that were sent to Sarah Island were there as secondary offenders. They had been in trouble before, they'd been transported, they were convicts, and they kept getting into trouble. These were what you would call the troublemakers at high school, the class clowns, the kids who keep wanting to get out of class and go and hang out in the toilets and smoke. All of those are the people that were being sent here, not the murderers, not the rapists, not the violent criminals. It was the absconders, the men who kept trying to escape, the people who talked back, the people that were caught drunk and disorderly and kept doing these things. They were the ones that were sent here, not necessarily the skilled men that they needed to run the settlement. So yes, Sarah Island maybe was Australia's first TAFE college because they were bringing in skilled people who could then teach the convicts the skills they needed to keep the settlement running. And I'm not just talking shipbuilding. You're talking about carpenters, stonemasons, bricklayers, bakers, blacksmiths were very important, timber workers, sawmillers. All of those skills were required because if they hadn't been there, the settlement would have failed completely. People have to realise that Sarah Island was on the edge of the universe.
Yeah.
There were no settlements anywhere else on the west coast at that time. The nearest settlement was way up in the northwest corner called Woolnorth. Yeah, and that was the closest, and Hobart was then the nearest going east. So you had to make sure you had the skills in order to keep that settlement running. And that's why people like David Hoy, the master shipwright, who were excellent at what they did, was so crucial to that settlement. There's a detail that we don't tell on the guided tour around Sarah Island, in that the soldiers who were posted to Sarah Island were often men who were unskilled as well. And they were a bit bored when they weren't on duty. And when David Hoy came to the settlement, he welcomed the soldiers into the shipyard when they had time off. And the soldiers worked alongside the convicts, learning the skills as well of shipbuilding. David Hoy probably did it for his own benefit because he wanted to build lots of really good quality ships and he needed as much help to do that as possible. But the soldiers knew that if they got these skills and were taught these skills, that once they left the army, they would then have skills that would give them work later on in their lives. So this is where the whole TAFE college idea comes into it. You're teaching people skills that are going to help them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, which sounds a little bit idyllic. And you did mention there that a lot of the convicts were secondary offenders, not violent offenders, because obviously they were sent to the gallows. But some of them didn't necessarily stay that way after life on Sarah Island. Things didn't seem to pan out so well for them, and there were quite a few violent offences by people who didn't have a history of violence once their time on Sarah Island had started.
We do try to talk about Sarah Island, not in glowing terms, but we certainly try to tell the story of Sarah Island as being one of where convicts themselves were able to find a sense of hope and a sense of purpose in their lives. But I do have to admit that the first 6 or 7 years on Sarah Island were an absolute hell on earth. It has a reputation of being a hell on earth. And the first few years on Sarah Island, certainly, I can certainly acknowledge that. The conditions were terrible. They were trying to carve out a settlement out of some of the harshest wilderness in the world. And if anybody ever has seen Alone Australia, that is the program that is set on the West Coast and very harsh conditions, particularly in winter. And the men there had a real sense of despair. For them, there was no escape. And a lot of them made the decision that their lives were hell. They were pretty much on starvation rations most of the time. The work was difficult. They were working in awful conditions, rain, hail, shine, and mostly at that time it was pretty nasty weather. They were only issued with 2 sets of clothing a year, and that had to last 6 months. Many men worked without shirts, without boots, and men did steal from each other in order to get extra food and clothing and things that they could trade in order to try and get food and tobacco. And many of the men decided that this was the end of the road for them. And one way to escape that hell on earth was to die. But in those days, you couldn't commit suicide. That meant that you were going to end up in purgatory and you were never going to get to heaven, and there was never going to be any redemption for you at all. We have to remember the men were deeply religious in those days. Religion was very, very important to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So men turned to things like murder in order to get out of this place, this hell on earth that they believed was going to be their last, that they were never going to escape from. Yeah. The murders were complex. You would think that if you murdered someone, you'd end up in hell, and therefore you're not actually saving yourself from hell on earth. But some of the men, not all of them, but some of the men came up with very complex and interesting ways of managing to get around the whole committing a crime and ended up in hell. And there's a story of, at least we know it's happened at least twice, where 3 men would get together and make a decision that they all wanted to escape from this place. And one man would draw the short straw, and he was the man that was to be murdered. But before he got murdered, he had the opportunity to go and see the chaplain and repent his sins and be blessed. And if he repented his sins, he would be forgiven. And if he died, he would then go straight to heaven. So
Wow.
you escape from hell by going to heaven. Okay?
Biblical
The
loopholes.
second man would very much a biblical loophole. Absolutely. The second is the man who was the murderer.
Mm-hmm.
So he would murder the first man, would be sent to Hobart for trial to be hanged. So the hangings didn't happen on Sarah Island, they happened in Hobart. But on his way to Hobart, he would repent and be sorry and confess his sins to the chaplain, who would then absolve him. And when he died on the gallows, he would then go to heaven.
Okay.
So that's 2 men escaping from hell on earth going to heaven. The third man was important. He had to be the witness to make sure the second man got hanged. Okay.
Right.
Now, the witness then had to be sent to Hobart to stand as witness on trial, and they often never got sent back to Sarah Island. So they escaped from Sarah Island by being the witness. So 3 escapes, and what we call government-sanctioned escapes, but also rather permanent escapes in the case of 2 of them.
Complex plans.
I'll take person number 3, thanks.
So while these are complex plans, there's also some pretty notable escapes. And I think that most Australians would, if they don't know the full story, would know the loose story of Alexander Pierce. It just made me think as you were talking about that and that plan, and when you kind of put that in place with their story and the group of men and the drawing of the short straw and how that was reported back to authorities once they were captured again, it kind of sort of fits into what you were just describing.
That's probably the only story that anybody knows about Sarah Island, is the story of Alexander Pierce, who has the reputation of being the cannibal convict.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's another complex but very interesting story. Alexander Pierce was one of 7 men who escaped from Sarah Island from a work gang. They weren't on the island. They were in Macquarie Harbour cutting timber, and they escaped in a very opportunistic escape.
Yes.
And I want to just point out that this particular escape happened in the first year of the settlement in September 1822. No one had managed to escape from Sarah Island and survive up until this point. No one. They had been escape attempts, but everyone had perished. So this particular escape attempt with Alexander Pierce, 7 men working in a convict gang, cutting down timber. When you're cutting down timber, one tool you have is an axe. And they found an opportunity. The guards weren't present, and they had the opportunity to escape. And they took all the rations that they had, which was only about 2 or 3 days worth, and they escaped. And they just headed inland, sort of going southeast, knowing that Hobart would be out there somewhere, and just keeping on going. And unfortunately for them, they chose probably the worst track through the wilderness that you could from Macquarie Harbour down to Hobart. It was steep cliffs going right up and down mountains, heavily wooded, very different, and then straight down into deep river systems, and then back up and down again and up and down. And they made very little progress in the first few weeks that they were gone. And they'd run out of food. They were all starving. 2 men actually turned back and went back the way they came and ended up back at Sarah Island, where they died in hospital from exposure and starvation.
Yep.
But the rest of them kept going. And they decided amongst themselves, again, the whole short straw thing, that the only way that they would survive would be to kill one of them and eat that person.
Again, Shannon, are we talking about this again? She keeps talking about people eating people in this podcast.
Well, this is definitely an appropriate story for the Sarah Island history, because it is probably the most famous cannibal story for Australian convict history. Yeah. What was interesting is that Robert Greenhill, who was also one of the men in Alexander Pierce's gang, was a sailor, and there was a law amongst sailors that if you got shipwrecked on a desert island and you had no way of surviving without in any way, there's no food, not enough water, but you knew that a ship was going to come and get you sometime, cannibalism, eating people, was considered okay.
Yes, we have talked about the law of the sea in a
that?
previous episode.
Good. Fantastic. So you've got the background history.
Much to Megan's dismay.
It's putting you off your lunch, isn't it, Megan?
Yep. Thanks, guys.
So Robert Greenhill proposed to the group that because they were in the middle of the wilderness with no way of surviving, it was like being shipwrecked, and therefore they could apply the law of the sea to their escape. Okay? They drew the short straw, and the short straw actually was a man who happened to be a flagellator on Sarah Island, someone who flogs the convicts in punishment, and they ate him first. I don't know whether it was a short straw thing or whether it was retaliation, but he was the first person. And basically they waited till he fell asleep, hit him on the head with the axe, chopped him up into little pieces, cooked him up over a campfire, ate what they could, carried what they could for the next few days. And they continued to do that over the next period of about three weeks or so. Kill someone, carry their rations with them, and then when they ran out and got weak again, kill the next person. Alexander Pierce was never meant to be the last man standing. Robert Greenhill was meant to be the last man standing. But unfortunately for Robert, his mate, his friend, got bitten by a snake. And they knew he was going to die, so they killed him to put him out of his agony, which left Alexander Pierce and Robert Greenhill. And they had a standoff. Once they'd finished eating Robert Greenhill's mate, they kept going. And it was basically Greenhill had the axe, and it was who was going to fall asleep first. They walked for 3 or 4 days, and neither of them slept in that time, because they knew whoever fell asleep first, the other person was going to grab the axe and kill them. And that's what happened. Robert Greenhill, even though he had the axe, fell asleep first, and Alexander Pierce grabbed the axe and bashed him over the head, and became the cannibal convict of Sarah Island.
Yeah.
I would
despite the
love
fact-
to know how we know this whole story.
Okay,
He's
This
come
is where it
home and he's
gets-
bragged to everybody about how this went down.
remember what I said about going to heaven and repenting your sins. Okay.
Okay.
So Alexander Pierce was at large for months. They didn't find him for months. He actually met up with some ex-convicts who were shepherds looking after sheep on a very isolated station, and stayed with them for months until the troopers caught up with him, found him. I think the others two of the shepherds got caught for sheep rustling or something, and then they caught Alexander Pierce as a result. And he went to Hobart, and they realised who he was, and he was interviewed by the magistrate and the constables. And he admitted that this is what he'd done, because he was so eaten up by the fact that he'd done this and hadn't been able to confess to a chaplain to repent his sins, because he was worried that if he died, he was going to hell. But they didn't believe him, and that ate him up. He became a very different man when he went back to Sarah Island. Partly he was going back to this hell on earth that he had thought he had escaped from. Secondly, he thought that if anything happened to him while he was on Sarah Island, remembering this was the worst of the worst places at this time, enormous numbers of floggings, starvation rations, heavy workload, men died of disease and accidents and that sort of thing. He was worried he was going to die and go to hell. And when another convict, Thomas Cox, approached Alexander Pierce and said, "You're one of the few people who've escaped and got out of here alive. I want to escape. Will you escape with me?" Alexander Pierce eventually was very reluctant, but did say yes in the end. And they escaped, not overland the way Alexander Pierce went, because he said, "I'm not doing that again." And they escaped up the eastern coast of Macquarie Harbour as far as the King River. Now, if you go and visit Strawn, you go on the train and you go along Macquarie Harbour and then up the King River. And you can see the King River at the mouth is actually quite broad. And they got to the mouth, south side of the King River, and that's when Thomas Cox admitted to Alexander Pierce that he couldn't swim, which meant that they were going to get recaptured, flogged, and put in bread and water, possibly put into isolation. It wasn't going to be good to get recaptured. And Alexander Pierce got mad and killed him and cut him up and had a bit of a meal, strung up the rest of his body in a tree, grabbed some of the meat, turned around and walked back down Macquarie Harbour and gave himself up to the authorities and said, "I've done it again." And this time they had to believe him because he had evidence on him.
Wow.
And that's how they know, because through the trial, he went to Hobart for trial, he was found guilty and hanged. And that's how we know the story, because of the trial transcripts and because of his story that he tells. So there's your answer, Megan. That's how we know.
Thank you.
You're
Now
welcome.
I want to know where he is now. Where did he end up after that?
He got hanged in Hobart and is buried in Hobart. But I'm pretty sure his skull is in a museum somewhere.
Wow.
can't
No,
remember
I
which
meant heaven or
museum.
hell. I meant where did he end up for eternity?
Well, I suspect he could have been in heaven, because he would have repented his sins and it would have been believed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So just be careful who you hang out with when you go up to heaven. That's all I can say.
Uh-huh. It's very good advice.
You mentioned the floggings in there, and I know that it was a big part of the convict's life and a fear. I read something while I was doing the outline for today's story that they used to stitch metal into the knots of, and they called it the Macquarie cat, like cat o' nine
Yeah.
tails was everywhere else, but that it was exceptionally brutal. at Sarah Island.
Yeah, and it was so brutal. The Macquarie Harbour cat was so brutal that they actually banned its use at places like Norfolk Island and Port Arthur because it was so bad. So people understand what a cat of nine tails is. Generally, it's a whip that's made of 9 strands of rope, usually with three knots per strand, and you use it to hit somebody on the back in order to open up his back and rip open the back and cause it. They're designed to cause maximum amount of agony with limited damage.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, you're just ripping skin and muscle, which can heal. It sounds gruesome, but the idea was you had a form of punishment which would cause maximum agony, but you're not killing or maiming your workforce. Okay. The Macquarie Harbour cat was a bigger, stronger, longer cat. So they took 3 cats of 9 tails and wove them together, still 9 strands, but they were longer and thicker. They had 7 knots per strand and lead pieces picked into them, sewn into them, so that the back would rip open from the very first lash, not after 5 or 6 lashes. So you're inflicting the maximum amount of pain, causing damage to make sure that the men got the message, I suppose.
Some of the punishments that they dished out were 100 lashes. Like, to me, it's unfathomable to think that a man could withstand being hit with that 100 times.
Yeah. And it's amazing. I will say that even though it was very cruel on Sarah Island, 100 lashes was the maximum.
Yep.
In Sydney, in the early years, flogging was also a form of punishment. And I know that there is a record of someone who received 900. That never happened on Sarah Island. No one would have survived that.
No.
And on Sarah Island, they were very careful. Very few men died of a flogging. John Ollery was the first man who died on Sarah Island of a flogging, and he was unwell. And he was actually given a flogging for asking the doctor for leniency and to not send him into work. He got punished for asking not to be sent into work because he was unwell.
Yep.
He was issued with 50 lashes and died after, I think it was 35. He died on the triangle.
Yeah. And the doctor he'd witness when there was floggings, and if he thought that it was becoming too much for the person, he could then say, no, that's enough.
Yeah.
And sort of intervene if it was getting to the point that it was becoming life-threatening for them.
Yes. But don't forget that the person would still then have to have his full lashes. So you might have a flogging and the doctor will go after 20 lashes, sorry, you've got to stop. This guy is not going to survive. They then take him to the hospital and salt water on the back to help it heal, maybe have a day of salve and oil or fat rubbed into the wounds and salt water to help it heal. And then as soon as that person is considered fit again, they go back to the flogging trial to have the next 30.
Wow.
So yes, the doctors were there to make sure that they didn't want to kill. They don't want to kill their workforce. So they were there to make sure that the workforce was the people were not going to die.
Yeah. Yeah. I did read somewhere too that it was incredibly hard to grow food on Sarah Island.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming, and I've heard stories about, a man being punished because he stole some fat off, I don't know whether it was a goat or a beef fat or whatever, but like little tiny things, like a little bit of animal fat were worth risking these severe punishments for.
Yeah, absolutely. And the gardens were heavily guarded because you could also get flogged or punished for stealing even a sprig of parsley. I know of one who was given 10 days solitary confinement for stealing parsley from the garden. Solitary confinement was considered five lashes, 1 day. So that's the equivalent of 50 lashes. And in fact, the harshest punishments that were given to men were not insolence, talking back, being drunk. It was stealing food and escaping. They were that's when you would get your maximum penalty of 10 days to 3 weeks of solitary confinement, 50 to 100 lashes.
What did solitary look like on Sarah Island?
Funnily enough, solitary confinement on Sarah Island in the first few years wasn't solitary confinement at all. It was basically a shed that they just locked the men up in and put them in bread and water. And often you could have, 12 people in there all at the same time. But later on, around about the middle of the settlement, they got a new commandant by the name of James Butler, and he was a follower of Jeremy Bentham, who was a reformist, and he is the person who came up with our solitary confinement as we still have it in our jails to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And that is isolating men in a very small, contained environment, and in those days, with no light, no windows, no comforts, and locking them away in darkness, isolation, and silence in order to contemplate their mortality in the hope that they would understand the errors of their ways and come out changed men, repentant, and going to be good citizens. And of course, we know that solitary confinement sends people insane. They actually built on Sarah Island a specific jail, solitary confinement jail. The walls of that jail are still standing on Sarah Island, but unfortunately the cells are partially collapsed. But when you have a look at the size of the cells, 1 metre in width, 3 metres or 2 metres in length, and about 2 metres in height. We go 3 feet by 6 foot by 6 foot. And when you say 6 foot high, the immediate thing you think of is 6 foot down. That's what you say when you put someone in a grave. They go 6 foot under. Well, these were the same dimensions of a grave.
Yeah.
So that the men could lie there thinking where their life was going to end up, contemplating, looking back on their lives if they were in the grave, and then seeing the errors of their ways and changing. But we know that it just sent men insane.
Yeah, I remember how powerful it was standing in that space, both at Sarah Island and again when I visited the female factory in Hobart.
Yeah.
And just thinking how it's hard to fathom now how people did that without going insane.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And in Port Arthur, they took it up another level as well, made it even more harsh at Port Arthur. Yeah, yeah.
Port Arthur felt a lot like like they might have been prepping for the insanity when I visited there. It gave me more of a psychiatric institution feel in Port Arthur when we visited that space. Tough stuff. We talk a lot in this podcast about, why did you do that? Why did you do that to people? And this treatment, we focus also a lot on, First Nations experience in those early days, but there was brutality everywhere. It wasn't just in the Europeans' treatment of Indigenous people, it was also in the treatment of the convicts. And there's some really significant and big things there that I really personally struggle with. But there's also a lot of hope and stories of resilience, and we're going to move on to the story of the Frederick. And this was one of the most remarkable stories I have ever heard in my life. What you guys have done to bring this to life and the lasting legacy that it has left. And the fact that I think probably for most people, especially us, you go out, you experience Sarah Island, you have a look around the Gordon River and the beauty of the place, and you get a little bit of an idea of the density of those forests and what it would have been like for the men out there cutting timber and trying to escape even. And then you come back to shore and have this really fun, beautiful experience of the most extraordinary tale right on the shores of the place that you've just had this adventure. We will have a bit of a chat about James Porter and his gang of men who just really achieved the bloody impossible. So I'll let you introduce James Porter because I have a feeling, Kiah, that you'll be able to do it in a far more condensed version than what I'll be able to.
I don't know if you're going to be right about that. That story's very close to my heart. I could talk about this forever.
Yep.
So early on in the podcast, we talked about the fact that Sarah Island was a significant place for shipbuilding, and they built many ships out of Huon pine. And David Hoy, the master shipwright, ended up there. And one of the things David Hoy did was make sure he got a group of convicts around him who he trained as highly skilled shipwrights, men with excellent skills. And one of those people was an incorrigible fellow by the name of James Porter, who I have a feeling would have been considered one of Australia's, teller of tall tales.
Yeah.
He obviously had the gift of the gab, this man. And he was a bit of a troublemaker. He was a rascal. He was a rogue, but he was never a criminal as such. He just got himself into all sorts of trouble, and sometimes he could talk his way out of it. And unfortunately for him in England, when he became a convict, he couldn't talk his way out of this one, and obviously kept getting into trouble. I think he was flogged. I think he had 800 floggings over the period of the time he was a convict, not all together, but kept getting into trouble and never stopped him. But he was obviously very good at what he did, and he became a highly skilled shipwright and was actually quite close to David Hoy. They got on really well. Now, James Porter, one of the reasons why he constantly got into trouble is that he was constantly trying to escape. He wanted his freedom.
Mhm.
And he got into all sorts of schemes and took every opportunity he could to escape. Even if he could escape from Sarah Island for 2 or 3 days, he considered that was a win, for him. And he got together with about 9 other men who plotted an escape from Sarah Island. Sarah Island, this is the end of the settlement. So we're talking 1832, early 1833. These men got together. They know the settlement is closing within a year. They know that David Hoy is desperate to build one last ship before the settlement closes. And it seems to be, we don't know for sure, but we seem to think that the design of this ship is very close to David Hoy's heart. They think that it's his best. We believe that it was one of his best designs. And he's really keen to get it done. And the convicts, we believe, actually persuaded David Hoy to start the ship, even though he was under orders not to start building any more ships. So somehow this ship got started. One of the things about this story is that we actually believe there's a possibility that James Porter, John Barker, William Shires, a couple of the convicts had come up with this concept because it was quite a large ship. It was a 120-tonne ship. It would carry quite a lot of people. And we think that they actually had intended it to be built and finished before the settlement closed so that they could then capture the settlement and get all of the convicts who were there, probably about 100 convicts, and escape with all of them. It was going to be a mass escape. The problem was there was delays. And some of those delays were caused by the convicts themselves. The main delay was they didn't want the ship to be finished in winter because they didn't want to escape on a ship that was untried and untested and deal with winter gales. knowing that they would have to go into fairly treacherous waters. So the convicts themselves kept delaying the ship being completed, and the settlement closed, and the commandant and the soldiers and the convicts all went back to Hobart and on to Port Arthur, and only 10 convicts were left behind with a small contingent of soldiers, with David Hoy and a captain to finish the ship. And they kept delaying and kept delaying until word had come back from Hobart saying, you guys have taken too long with this ship. We're going to send some shipwrights over from Hobart. We're going to help you finish this, and then you can sail it back. And the convicts went, ooh, we don't want anyone else here. Right, we have to finish this ship. And they finished in really quick time. But ideally, they finished it in January, which is the best weather for them to escape. So they got their wish. They finished the ship in January. And they waited and waited and waited. They couldn't find the best time to capture this ship. They had to wait for it to be launched. They had to wait for the sails to be put on. They had to wait for this. They had to wait for that. And then eventually the captain said, right, we're leaving tomorrow. And the convicts are like, oh, we've got to do this. We're going to have to do this on the voyage. We'll capture the ship on the voyage. Left Sarah Island, sailed up Macquarie Harbour, got to the entrance to Macquarie Harbour, which is known as Hell's Gates because it's a very narrow and treacherous entrance. And they couldn't get through. So the captain turned the ship around and anchored it just inside the entrance to Macquarie Harbour and said, right, we'll sail tomorrow. It'll be fine. We'll wait for the tide to turn. We'll sail tomorrow. And the convicts just went, this is our opportunity. We're going to steal this ship. And the captain, notorious for drinking, one of the soldiers loved singing. James Porter lured him down below. James Porter had a very nice baritone, by the way, and sang, took him down below, and they were singing songs and creating a hullabaloo, lots of noise from singing their favourite song. We think it was a pornographic song, but we can't be 100% sure. It certainly had to do with somebody lying underneath a rose bush.
I just like James Porter more and more.
Like I said, he is the teller of tall tales. He is a skilled storyteller. Amazing, a real rogue. And they also persuaded the captain of the guard, who was a keen fisherman, to go fishing. One of the convicts went off with him, and they got the captain to agree. Yeah, well, we're not going anywhere. Everything's fine. No, don't lock the convicts away. I need them because they're my crew, and they've got to do some stuff around the boat, so don't lock them down. No, and you can go off fishing and all that sort of stuff. And the convicts went and stole all the muskets on board, and then took over the ship, captured the soldiers that were still there on guard, and locked them in the forecastle. Went down and stormed the cabin where the captain was having drinks with David Hoy, and captured both of them at gunpoint. Didn't fire a shot, but didn't kill anyone. And then signalled to the person who was fishing to come back to the ship, by which stage they'd already got all the soldiers and the captain and David Hoy into a little boat, and they just put the captain of the guard in the boat with them, and then took them to shore and left them with some supplies. And then we're not waiting till morning, we're going. And they left, and they managed to, I don't know how they managed to get out of Hell's Gates, because it would have been a very difficult thing to do. But they managed to get out of Hell's Gates, and they turned south, and they went south of Tasmania, south of New Zealand, right into the Southern Ocean, hit terrible storms for weeks. They were at sea for 6 weeks, but they had terrible storms for about 4 of those weeks. And eventually made it all the way to Chile in South America. They barely got there. They had no charts. They had terrible storms. They could barely do any readings using a sextant, which was their only piece of navigational equipment. And John Barker, he was a watchmaker and a gunsmith. He taught himself navigation and they did all of their navigation by dead reckoning. And they made it to Chile. John Barker thought they still had 500 miles to go.
Yeah.
But they made it to Chile and just got the teeniest bottom bit of Chile. If they hadn't got their course correct, they would have missed the bottom of Chile and sailed straight past the bottom of South America and probably never seen again. They were within days of sinking the ship. But they made it to Chile and made it to civilization there. And the Chileans knew vaguely there were some convicts on the run. They'd heard a rumour. Governor Arthur, when he discovered they'd escaped, sent ships in every direction with word that there's these 10 convicts who are on the run, and if you find them, bring them back. They sort of thought they could be them, but they weren't sure. So they said, oh, right, well, why don't you guys stay here and we'll write back to Van Diemen's Land and get a description of the convicts, and we'll come and match them when they arrive. And by the way, while you're here, you're all shipwrights, right? We've got a ship on the stocks here and we can't finish it because we haven't got the skills of the people to do it. Would you mind? I'll tell you what, how about we employ you to go and work in the shipyard while you're here in Chile while we wait to find out whether you're escaped convicts or not? And they did. They stayed there for a year. 3 of them married. 1 of them had a baby boy, happily settled in, but not all of them were happy and settled. So 3 of them who were sailors decided they wanted to leave, and they managed to make their way onto an American ship that was in Valdivia at the time and left. And the authorities in Valdivia had no idea, so they couldn't catch them. So they were gone. And we suspect they may have become American citizens. Who knows? Never heard of again. Who knows? After the 3 left on the American ship, the 6 that were remaining were told, right, no, actually, we still don't know whether or not you're escaped convicts, or we haven't confirmed it, or whether. I think you better report to the guardhouse every day. You're still free to be citizens. You're still free to have a job, but you've got to make sure that you report to the guard. Thing a bit like on parole. And 3 of them decided they didn't like that, and that included John Barker. And they offered to build a ship for the governor of Valdivia, like a private luxury yacht. And they built it for him. And then they said, it's finished. Do you want to go on a maiden voyage? And the governor's going, oh, this sounds good. Yeah, all right. So do you want to have a party on board? Yeah, sure. Well, you better give us the food and we'll put it on board for you and we'll stow it. And then we'll rig it for you and we'll get it all ready for you, ready for your maiden voyage. And you can have a party. And then they stole it and sailed it.
I could see that happening. How could he not see that happening?
Well, the governor didn't. He didn't see that happening. So they escaped. And then the governor got really pissed off. Not only had 3 convicts escaped, but he lost his private luxury yacht as well. So the 4 that were remaining were actually put into prison in Chile and held there until the British turned up and collected them. Not because they'd done anything wrong, but because the governor didn't trust them after that. And then they were sent back to England and kept in the hulks on the River Thames for a year. And then they were sent back to Hobart because Governor Arthur had wanted to put them on trial for piracy and mutiny and was determined that they were coming back. They weren't going to get tried in England. They were going to get tried in Hobart. So they got transported a second time and ended up in Hobart on trial. But by that stage, Governor Arthur had gone back to England and John Franklin was the governor of Tasmania, and he was a much more lenient man. Yes, the trial went ahead. It took nearly 2 years for them being on trial, partly because the judge who was presiding over the case kept having points of law that he wanted clarified and kept having to write back to England to the authorities there to have points of law clarified and then waiting for the response. No email, no internet in those days. Months. So these men were in jail in Hobart for nearly 2 years, believing that they were going to get hanged. And on the very last time they fronted up in front of the judge, something happened. We don't know. We don't know what happened, but the 4 convicts fronted up and changed their plea. Instead of pleading guilty for piracy and mutiny, they turned around and said, no, we're not guilty. And we don't know how that changed. We don't know what happened with the judge. We don't know all the deliberations, but they changed their plea, which meant that there was a possibility that they mightn't get hanged, but it all depended on whether the judge decided they were guilty or not. And I can't tell you anymore because you have to come and see the play.
Oh, Tim's gonna hate you. No.
Tim listens to all of our episodes and he gets so cranky when I do the same thing and I leave an open-ended story. So yes, that's where we're going to leave it.
Yeah, so I can't tell you anymore because you have to come and see the play, which is the version of that story in which we have two actors telling the story and building a ship in the play at the same time, and then stealing it and then sailing it to Chile all through the play. And it's a fantastic play and it's very interactive and lots of fun. But I do have to keep your friend Tim in suspense.
We'll just let Tim know that I played a very important role in the play. The last time I went, I got to be the jellyfish.
One of the best roles.
And Charlie, my son, was the man that was out fishing the whole time.
Oh, Corporal German. Fantastic. Excellent. That's wonderful. Did he catch any fish is my question.
There was some stuff in the bucket, so I'm assuming that there's a lot going on, Kiah. You know as well as anyone that it's hard to focus on one thing. We did have some great people that were involved this time. It was both times, actually. So I have seen this play twice. Once 10 years ago, I had never seen a pantomime before when it was my first experience, and we loved it. And then it was the way that I finished my birthday celebrations a couple of weeks ago when we were in Tassie, and we were thinking that it wasn't on, but it is the longest running performance in Australia. Am I right?
The longest running play. We've been continually running in Strawn, at that site in Strawn for over 31 years, 31 and a half years now.
Well, the universes aligned, and for my birthday, because when we originally looked, it was not going to be on. And we had such a great experience the first time I really wanted to come back. And then it must have been just like a day or two before, Scott just thought, oh, I'll check. And there was going to be a performance that day. So I got to experience it the second time. And the first time, Elsie and Jack, who are my older children, were still late primary school, like year 5 and 6, and Charlie was only 2. And because it was my birthday, I had a phone call from the kids before we went in, and their perception around when they went to Tassie, and they're like, we're so sick of looking at old stuff. And then going and experiencing this play, they're now in their 20s, and when I spoke to them on the phone and I said, oh, we're taking Charlie to the play, The Ship That Never Was. And they're like, oh, about the convicts that stole the ship and they sailed all the way to Chile. They remembered that story. They don't like history. They're not invested in any of it. It will change. They're my children. There's genetics as they get older. But they were so excited because they had such a great time. And then Charlie went this time and he laughed. He laughed so much. We laughed so much.
Did we listen to the same story?
Yeah, what a funny story.
It's not funny.
It really is. It's just such a great experience, especially if you get to do the Sarah Island tour that day. I did send Kiah an email yesterday or the day before when I realised that Richard, the man who wrote the play, is Kiah's dad. And I was thinking about this because on my first trip to Sarah Island, our guide was this passionate man who told us all about Richard Davey and his work and how he had collected the history of Sarah Island so it could be shared with people, and me being in that space and thinking, oh, this man and his legacy. And it's very similar to what we do here, where we take stories and share them with people so they get to experience wonderful things. And then I realized that he was Kiah's dad. So I wanted to let her know that the kids, it was the one thing, his work was the one thing that they remembered. It made their trip, it made our trip, and we were so excited to be able to go and see it again.
That's a really, really special connection. And your story is one we hear often. First of all, we get people coming back again and again and again to see the play because they love it. And of course, because we have audience interaction, every single performance is different. You never know what the audience is going to throw at you. We never know how we're going to react to the audience. When you have a big audience of 140, 150 people, you get a different sort of vibe than when you get an audience of only 12. And we get everything in between. You get audiences full of kids and audiences with no children, and it's a different vibe again. So you never quite know. And I think that's why having the play going for 31 years is because every single time it's fresh, it's new, it's different, both for the actors and also for the audience, which is great. And I do occasionally get those fantastic responses like your kids gave of oh my God, that was so much fun, and I got to do this, and I was this person, and I remember this. And we absolutely love hearing about those from people.
It's such a brilliant way to bring history to life in that format. And it really does. You mentioned earlier about wanting to convey the hope and the positivity of the story of Sarah Island. And I think that exploring this story of the escape of the Frederick and James Porter, there's so much, like, for a travel podcast, we talk about social justice issues a lot, and the resilience of these characters and the treatment and their desperation for liberty outside of what they were experiencing there. And I mean, we joke now, about how, they stole some silks, or they stole a piece of bread, or, a piece of parsley. And this is the thing that got some of these people into situations. And generally it wasn't because they were bad people. It was because they were hungry or desperate or poor. And there's a lot of mirrors held up to some experiences now, but to go and see this play in such a fun and interactive way, it brings it to life in a totally different way than you experience by just doing a tour or reading a book. So it makes it really lasting. And that was definitely our experience. So this was obviously really important to your dad, Kiah, who was obviously the founder of the Round Earth Company. You guys lived in Western Australia, is that right? He wasn't born in Strawn. What drew him to Sarah Island?
A very long story told short. My dad was actually born in Sydney, and my mum was born in Alice Springs, and my sister and I were born in Perth, Western Australia. So we've covered the whole of the country now with Tassie. Before I was born, my dad got into theatre. He was actually a Catholic brother and met my mother when he blew himself up in a laboratory experiment and got glass into his eyes. And she was the nursing sister in charge of the ward when he was admitted to hospital. And they fell in love in hospital. In fact, my dad fell in love with my mum's voice because he didn't see her. His eyes were bandaged. It's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they eventually got together. Long story. Eventually got together and moved to Western Australia, where my dad got into theatre, deciding he wanted to be a carpenter, and he started building sets for theatre. But he's always been into literature. He's always been into the dramatic. And very quickly, they invited him to come and be an extra on stage to fill up certain scenes. And then he'd go off and do a show, and then he started writing. And so I grew up with him writing children's theatre and children's operas and performing them in Western Australia. And he also spent a lot of time working with other artists, musicians and artists, and travelling around outback Western Australia to Aboriginal settlements and on a cultural exchange. And eventually he went overseas. We travelled overseas for 4 years. My dad worked with various children's theatre companies over there. And when we came back to Australia, we decided to move to Tasmania. And on moving to Tasmania, my dad is one of the things, he calls himself a storyteller, not a playwright. And he likes to tell real, true stories because they are more bizarre than anything he could make up himself.
Yes.
Exactly.
Can you see
And
why
so
I
he
really
got
like
into-
Kiah's dad?
And so he got into researching local Tasmanian stories. And he read a book about this escape. It was a book for young adults, I think, written about this escape of the 10 convicts, and got quite intrigued by this story and realizing it was a true story. And when he was approached by the general manager of a theatre company, Charlie Parkinson, to write a new play for a group of young actors, Dad went, well, what about this story? It's a local story. It's about convicts. It's an escape story. It's got everything. It's a boy's own adventure. It's got a bit of romance. It's got a bit of high seas drama. It's got a bit of a twist in the tale right at the end. It's all really fascinating. And so he wrote this play for a cast of 10, which was performed at the Peacock Theatre in Hobart, which is a bit of an iconic theatre in Hobart. Fast forwarding 10 years later, a Parks and Wildlife officer from Strawn had seen the play and had decided it needed to come to Strawn, and he tracked down my dad and said, you know that play? Do you reckon you could come and do it for the tourists in Strawn? And my dad went, well, I can't bring 10 actors over. I'll rewrite it. I'll rewrite it for 2 and a smaller set. And they brought it over. So 31 and a half years ago, my dad came over with a little bit of a flimsy set that pulled to pieces, and another young actor, budding actor, who was really keen to get in on the scene. And we arrived in January and decided they were going to do, I don't know, a handful of performances, and then they'd pack up and go back to Hobart. The locals loved it so much, and we were so welcomed by the locals. And they kept saying, no, you can't do it just for a couple of days. No, you've got to come back at Easter, and you've got to come back, and you've got to come back next season, and you've got to come back. So what we thought was going to be about 3 weeks ended up at 31 and a half years. We were welcomed by the community so much. And we were invited on the cruise to go up the Gordon River. And we were invited to go and do all sorts of things and explore the West Coast. But when we went on the cruise, we stopped at Sarah Island. And my dad connected the dots and went, oh, Sarah Island has a much bigger story than just this escape, and a much more interesting story. And he got quite intrigued by it, remembering that when we first arrived 31 and a half years ago, there were no guided tours on Sarah Island. You just wandered around and read a few signs. And my dad spent a winter, nearly 2 winters, in the archives in Hobart, going back to the original records from Sarah Island, partly to answer people's questions. People would come to the show and go, oh, you know something about the story of Sarah Island. I've got this question and that question and that question. But also partly to satisfy his own curiosity about the place. And he got so into the story, particularly the story of David Hoy and the ships, and that he approached the cruise companies and said to them, how do you guys feel about having a guided tour on Sarah Island as part of your cruise? And they went, oh, we'll give it a go. Yeah, just come out whenever you want to and we'll just give it a go. And it was so popular and it worked so well that we approached the cruise companies and they accepted us and adopted the tours as part of their cruise. And we've been doing that now for 29 years. It's the story that gets underneath your skin.
Yeah.
And it's the place that gets underneath your skin. And those were the 2 things that I think really connected with my father and made him want to stay and made him want to keep this story going. But it's just an amazing story anyway, you know.
It is. And then when you put somebody creative's passion behind it, it's created a legacy for thousands and thousands of people who may have just been to Strawn and had a look and said, this is beautiful, but they get to take this thing home, you know, with them, this story, this experience. And it's a pretty significant legacy to leave, I think.
Yeah, I feel very proud to be carrying on my father's legacy. I worked with him right from day dot. So I've been living in Strawn and coming to and fro for over 31 years, and that's my community now. Probably the most important to me is the fact that my dad was such a great storyteller and such a beautiful man. He touched the hearts of so many people, and I just feel really honoured to keep his storytelling abilities and his stories alive and carrying on the West Coast and contributing to the community that has looked after us for so long as well.
Yeah, well, I'm very grateful that you did choose to do that, Kiah, because it was such a brilliant experience, and I can't recommend it enough for anyone traveling, especially if you've got children. Like, the play's not designed just for children. Like, the adults get as much, if not more, out of it. Out of that first trip to Tassie, the one thing I wanted to re-experience was a night at the Richard Davey Amphitheatre watching The Ship That Never Was. So thank you, Kiah, for joining us. We appreciate your time this morning so much, and you did such a great job with James Porter's story, and Tim can yell at you this week for leaving the cliffhanger instead of me. If people do want to add this to their travel itinerary, The Ship That Never Was, the live performances are every day from September to May. Is that right, Kiah?
That is correct, yes. Yep.
Yes, at the Richard Davey Amphitheatre in Strawn, and the performances take place at 5:30. It fits in perfectly if you've got a cruise day planned, and you can come back and have a look at the sawmill and have some dinner and then pop over to the amphitheatre. You guys have structured it so great. And if you would like more information about this experience or a tour on Sarah Island, you can find more information at roundearth.com.au. Thank you, Kiah, so much for sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate it.
And thank you very much for inviting me on your podcast, Shannon and Megan. It's been lovely.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you would like to access more about the places or information included in today's topic, please visit our website, ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. If you would like to follow us on our adventures, check us out on Facebook or Insta. Our creative writer is Shannon Walters, and our podcast is produced at Bellevue Studio in the Hunter Valley with audio production by Megan Anderson. We love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review, and if you would like to hear more, please subscribe. We look forward to you joining us for our next adventure.